Stories 1. The Gold Seekers. The Curse of the Forest. Jack Harper returned to his rundown house in a small American town, trying to suppress the heavy burden of anxiety weighing on his chest. Mortgage payments, school fees for the kids, and mounting debts. All these thoughts gnawed at his mind. His eyes fell on the map he was holding. It was an old, worn-out piece of paper, but in Jack's hands, it felt like a map to a new life. There was a deep sense of hope within him, but at the same time, that hope was born out of desperation. As he opened the door, he was greeted by the weary face of his wife, Laura. Laura hadn't spoken much in days. There was a lost gleam in her eyes. When Jack hugged her, the coldness of her skin increased his worries. Laura's depression had only added to the weight on the family. "We have to do this," Jack said, looking into his wife's eyes. "This might be our last chance." Laura took a deep breath, but there was neither hope nor fear in her voice. "I know, Jack. It's just, what if we fail?" Jack tried to reassure her, but even he wasn't convinced by his own words. "We can't fail, Laura. We have no other choice. We have to take this risk for our children, for our future." Laura nodded and closed her eyes, ignoring the faint sobs coming from the children's room. Everything in their lives had become so heavy that they were desperately searching for a way out. This gold prospecting trip, no matter how dangerous, seemed like an escape route. Michael Davis had struggled to sleep since his wife's death. Whenever he lay his head on the pillow, the details of the accident would replay in his mind. He knew he was to blame. Perhaps he could have protected her better. As he wrestled with these thoughts, Jack's offer to search for gold was the escape Michael desperately needed. Gold. Perhaps this was what could reconnect him with life. Maybe it was a chance to reclaim everything he had lost, a way to soothe his wife's spirit. That's why he accepted Jack's offer. Deep down, he knew it might be a mistake, but those dark thoughts pushed him onto a different path. Early in the morning, Jack, Laura, Michael, Sarah, and Jimmy gathered at the meeting point near the edge of the forest. They had a few days' worth of supplies, along with basic tools like shovels and pickaxes. Each of them was filled with dreams of finding gold by the river, but there was also a sense of unease within. As they entered the forest, the air was heavy and silent. Not even the birds were singing. Each step felt like they were treading on a buried secret. When they reached the riverbank, they decided to set up camp. "This place looks good," Jack said, looking around. "It's close to the river and seems safe." The others nodded, but there was a sense of discomfort in their eyes. Though no one said it aloud, the eerie silence within the forest was unsettling. That first night, everyone tried to sleep, but the faint whispers coming from deep within the forest disturbed them. Jack thought it was just the sound of the wind, but it was so strange, almost like a melody carried by the breeze. Michael, however, swore he heard a voice whispering his wife's name during a moment of wakefulness in the middle of the night. But he told himself it was just a figment of his imagination. The shadows of the past were trying to reclaim him. Laura tried to sleep while thinking of her children, but the dark figures she saw in her dreams sent chills down her spine. She woke up, trying to convince herself it was all just a nightmare, but she found nothing to prove it wasn't real. Sarah and Jimmy also had disturbing dreams, but when morning came, no one shared their dreams with the others. Each of them thought it was just their minds playing tricks on them. With the first light of dawn, the group began searching for gold in the river. At first, everything seemed normal. They dug through the earth, sifted through gravel, and examined the sediments accumulating in the river. But after a few hours, strange things began to happen. As they dug deeper, they started finding old bones. No one knew what to make of it, but these findings made them feel that something was terribly wrong. At one point, Jimmy dug up an old medallion while excavating a deep pit. It had strange symbols engraved on it. This medallion was connected to an ancient curse of the forest, but Jimmy wasn't aware of that. He merely thought the medallion might be valuable and slipped it into his pocket. However, with the discovery of the medallion, the curse of the forest began to awaken. Strange sounds, figures, and whispers started emanating from the depths of the forest. With each step, they felt as if someone was watching them. The group began to feel increasingly uneasy about these strange occurrences. Laura started to believe this whole expedition was cursed. Michael tried to convince himself that it was merely a reflection of the past, but the truth was far darker and deeper. One night, Jack dreamt of a little girl lost in the forest. The girl looked at him and whispered, "Save us from here." This dream left a deep impression on Jack's mind. When he woke up in the morning, he tried to recall the girl's face but couldn't. However, the dream had already embedded itself in his subconscious. The curse of the forest was slowly taking hold of them. Their trust in each other began to crumble. Under the influence of the medallion, Jimmy started behaving more and more strangely. Sarah felt as if the grief from her mother's death was resurfacing in this forest. Meanwhile, Michael swore he could hear his wife's voice. Eventually, the curse of the forest fully revealed itself. The group tried to escape the forest, but it wouldn't let them go. Each of them had to face their own fears, and those fears began to consume them. Jack remembered the old map he found by the river. The map indicated a path that led deeper into the forest, but that path would be their undoing. When Jimmy regained consciousness, he realized he was in the middle of a dark forest. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were shadows watching him from the darkness. These shadows seemed familiar, like ghosts from his past. His brother's face would appear and disappear in the darkness, silently saying something, but the words were incomprehensible. Jimmy struggled to free himself from these visions, but found he couldn't stand. Fear and guilt had paralyzed him. Meanwhile, Jack, Michael, and the others were searching for Jimmy. As the darkness deepened, each of them encountered strange sounds and figures within the forest, but no one could grasp what was real. Their minds were confused, and their fears had taken hold of them. Michael eventually found Jimmy, but he was lying unconscious on the ground. Michael tried to wake him up, but there was no response from Jimmy. At that moment, he heard a whisper behind him. When he turned, he could see Jack and the others, but something felt wrong. When Jack reached Michael, they found Jimmy unconscious. They carried him back to the tent, trying to figure out what to do next. However, Jimmy's condition only intensified the dark clouds hanging over the group. Each of them could feel that the forest had taken hold of them. Jimmy was lost in the depths of the forest. The medallion in his pocket seemed to be pulling him somewhere. His mind was clouded, and he couldn't think rationally. With each step, memories of past pains and regrets resurfaced. He recalled the day he lost his brother in a mining accident. The guilt of not being able to save his brother had haunted him ever since. But the dark power within the forest deepened his pain even further. When Jimmy reached an ancient altar, he took out the medallion and placed it on the altar. At that moment, visions from the past flashed before his eyes. His brother looked at him and asked, "Why did you leave me?" Jimmy knew these visions weren't real, but the pain within him was driving him mad. Suddenly, the medallion on the altar began to glow, and Jimmy collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Jack, Michael, and the others continued their search for Jimmy. As the darkness deepened, Each of them encountered strange sounds and figures within the forest, but no one could discern what was real. Their minds were confused, and their fears had taken hold of them. Michael eventually found Jimmy lying unconscious on the ground. He tried to wake him up, but Jimmy didn't respond. Behind him, Michael heard a whisper. When he turned around, he could see Jack and the others, but something felt wrong. When Jack reached Michael, they found Jimmy still unconscious. They carried him back to the tent, unsure of what to do next. However, Jimmy's condition only intensified the dark clouds hanging over the group. Each of them could feel that the forest had taken hold of them. Jimmy remained unconscious, but his face bore a strange expression, as though something otherworldly was playing out in his mind. Jack sat by his side, watching him closely, trying to decipher the mumbled whispers escaping from Jimmy's lips. The whispers seemed to blend with the eerie murmurs emanating from the depths of the forest, creating an unsettling harmony that gnawed at Jack's nerves. Meanwhile, Sarah, gripped by her own haunting memories, wandered aimlessly around the camp. The voices of her mother, lost to illness, seemed to call out to her, pulling her deeper into her own despair. She couldn't shake the feeling that her mother was somewhere in the forest, waiting to be found. The thought consumed her, pushing her closer to the edge of sanity. Michael, too, felt the oppressive weight of the forest's influence. He had sworn he'd heard his late wife's voice, a sound he both longed for and feared. It was as if the forest was dredging up the past, using it as a weapon to weaken them, to lure them further into its dark heart. As night fell once again, the group was left more fractured and vulnerable than ever. The forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, feeding off their fears, their guilt, and their grief. By now, the forest had fully seized control. The group tried to gather their thoughts, to plan an escape, but the curse was deeply embedded in their minds, clouding their judgment. Each of them was grappling with their own demons, and the forest exploited these weaknesses mercilessly. Michael had strayed far from the camp, lost in a labyrinth of memories and illusions. Visions of his wife haunted him at every turn, her face appearing and disappearing like a mirage. These hallucinations blurred the line between reality and nightmare, leaving Michael helpless in the face of the forest's malevolent power. Sarah, driven by the sound of her mother's voice, followed it blindly into the depths of the woods. She didn't know where it would lead her, but the voice was insistent, and she couldn't resist its pull any longer. Jack and Laura, realizing they were losing both Sarah and Michael to the forest, set out after them. But the deeper they ventured, the more disoriented they became. Time and space seemed to warp around them, as if the forest itself was twisting reality to trap them. What had begun as a quest for gold had become a desperate struggle for survival. Exhausted and desperate, the group found themselves lost in the forest with no clear way out. Jimmy's strange behavior, Michael's disappearance, and Sarah's mental deterioration had plunged them into a deep despair. Jack, holding on to a last shred of hope, turned to Laura. "We have to get out of here. But how?" Laura's eyes reflected the fear that had taken hold of her heart. "I don't think the forest will let us go." At that moment, Jimmy suddenly stood up. His eyes were vacant, as if he were in another world. The medallion, glowing faintly, was clutched in his hand. It seemed to have formed a bond with the curse of the forest, fully possessing Jimmy. "Jimmy, what are you doing?" Jack shouted, but Jimmy didn't seem to hear him. He began to walk swiftly into the depths of the forest. Jack and Laura tried to follow, but Jimmy was moving too fast. He vanished into the darkness before their eyes. With Jimmy gone, Jack and Laura were left completely alone in the forest. There was no sign of Michael or Sarah. The darkness around them thickened, and their minds were clouded with confusion and fear. Laura kept seeing the vision of a little girl. The image clung to her thoughts, rendering her helpless. Eventually, Jack and Laura stumbled upon a clearing in the forest. In the center stood an ancient altar, surrounded by strange symbols and markings. Jack realized that this altar was the source of the forest's dark power. Lying on the ground near the altar was Michael. His body was lifeless, and his face bore an expression of eerie calm. Laura rushed to his side, but Michael's eyes were vacant, void of any sign of life. The forest had claimed him completely. As Jack and Laura stood in shock, figures began to emerge from the shadows surrounding the altar. These were the spirits of the forest's former inhabitants, now bound to the curse. They were drawn to Jack and Laura, intent on adding them to their ranks. Jack tried to protect Laura, but the power of the forest was overwhelming. The figures advanced slowly, forcing them closer to the altar. Jack, filled with despair, turned to Laura. "We're not getting out of here, Laura. The forest won't let us go." Laura looked into Jack's eyes and said softly, "But at least we're together." In that moment, Jack realized a painful truth. He had failed to protect his family, but being with Laura was all that mattered to him now. The figures continued to push Jack and Laura toward the altar. Suddenly, Jack remembered the words spoken by the little girl in his dream. "Save us from here." As they reached the altar, the meaning of those words became clear. The curse of the forest wasn't just a curse. It was a prison for the souls trapped within, waiting to be freed. But it was too late. As Jack and Laura were forced onto the altar, the dark power of the forest engulfed them completely. The last light within the forest faded away as the figures disappeared back into the shadows. When morning came, the forest was silent and serene. But deep within, a dark secret remained. There was no trace of Jack and Laura. The curse of the forest had swallowed them whole. Michael, Sarah, and Jimmy were also lost, with no sign left behind. Yet somewhere within the forest, the soul of a little girl found peace. The curse of the forest was not broken, but perhaps one day, the secret of the forest would be uncovered, and the curse would be lifted forever. Stories 2. The Call of the Dark Forest. A group of old university friends, now scattered across Europe, decides to reunite for a nature hike and camping trip. Though they've all taken different paths in life, this camping trip is seen as an opportunity to rekindle their past bonds. The location they've chosen is a remote and ominous forest known as the Hidden Woods. This forest, shrouded in mystery, is infamous in local lore for the many who have entered and never returned. Luke is the group's leader. He has become a successful entrepreneur, but deep down, he feels something is missing in his life. Oliver, a sharp and attentive engineer. He has a knack for solving problems, and has had a fascination with nature since childhood. Clara, a psychology graduate with high emotional intelligence. She acts as the emotional anchor of the group. Sophie, an adventurous spirit, always eager to explore new places. However, she harbors a traumatic experience from her past that she tries to keep hidden. The group meets at a small, quaint village at the edge of the Hidden Woods. The village is steeped in ancient traditions and whispers about the forest, but the friends dismiss these as mere superstitions. Lucas, the de facto leader, organizes the supplies, and they set out early in the morning, excited for the adventure ahead. As they enter the forest, the atmosphere shifts. The trees seem to close in around them, the light from the sun dimming under the dense canopy. A strange silence falls, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. The further they go, the more oppressive the forest feels, as if it's watching them. On their first night in the forest, they set up camp by a small, stagnant pond. As they gather around the fire, Sophie mentions feeling an eerie familiarity with the place, but she can't pinpoint why. Oliver, ever the skeptic, brushes it off as the imagination playing tricks in the dark. Clara, sensing the unease in Sophie, tries to distract the group with light-hearted stories from their university days. But the forest doesn't let them forget where they are. Throughout the night, they hear faint whispers carried by the wind, almost as if the trees themselves are speaking. Lucas dismisses it as the sounds of the forest, but Clara notices that Sophie seems particularly disturbed, though she says nothing. The next day, as they continue deeper into the woods, they stumble upon an old, abandoned cabin. The structure is barely standing, overgrown with vines and moss. Lucas, intrigued, suggests they explore it. Inside, they find signs of recent occupation, old weathered map, strange symbols carved into the wooden walls, and what looks like a journal, its pages filled with cryptic writings in a language none of them recognize. As they examine the journal, Oliver finds a passage that speaks of a curse tied to the forest, a curse that ensures those who enter never leave. Clara, now visibly uncomfortable, urges the group to leave the cabin and continue on their way. But Lucas, curious and determined, insists on staying a bit longer to see what else they might uncover. That night, back at their camp, the forest seems even darker and more oppressive. Sophie becomes increasingly agitated, claiming she sees figures moving in the shadows, but every time the others look, they see nothing. Lucas tries to calm her, but she becomes hysterical, insisting they must leave immediately. Oliver and Clara try to reason with her, suggesting it's just the stress and isolation getting to her. But as the night wears on, the group starts experiencing strange occurrences, whispers in the wind that seem to call their names, shadows that dart just out of sight, and a sense of being watched. The next morning, Lucas wakes up to find Sophie gone. Her sleeping bag is empty, and her belongings are still at the camp. The group searches frantically, but finds no trace of her. As panic sets in, they realize that the forest has more in store for them than they could have ever imagined. With Sophie missing, the group is torn between staying in the forest to search for her and heading back to the village to get help. Lucas, feeling responsible, decides they must press on and find her. As they delve deeper into the forest, they start noticing strange symbols carved into the trees, similar to those they saw in the cabin. The symbols seem to guide them, but to where, they do not know. Oliver, using his engineering skills, tries to map out their path, but no matter how far they walk, they always seem to end up back at the same spot. The forest itself seems to be twisting their sense of direction, leading them in circles. Clara, sensing the growing tension, tries to keep the group calm, but even she starts to feel the weight of the forest pressing down on them. As the day turns into night, the group stumbles upon a clearing where they find what appears to be a ritual site. In the center lies a stone altar, stained with something dark. Around the altar are more of the strange symbols, and in the dirt they find fresh footprints leading away from the site. The footprints are small, possibly Sophie's, and they lead deeper into the darkness. That night, they camp near the clearing, though none of them can sleep. Clara begins to have vivid nightmares of the forest and its past. In her dreams, she sees figures clad in dark robes performing rituals under the moonlight, chanting in a language she doesn't understand. She watches as they summon something from the depths of the forest, something ancient and malevolent. When she wakes, she finds that her dreams were more than just nightmares. The same symbols from her dreams are now etched into the ground around their camp, and the air is thick with the smell of decay. Lucas, who had also been plagued by disturbing dreams, begins to question whether they are truly alone in the forest. As they follow the footprints, the forest becomes more oppressive, the trees seeming to close in around them. They begin to hear Sophie's voice, calling out for help, but it always seems just out of reach. Oliver, the rational one, insists it's just the wind playing tricks, but deep down, he knows something is very wrong. The forest plays with their minds, showing them glimpses of their deepest fears. Lucas sees his reflection in the water, only to find a decayed version of himself staring back. Clara hears the voices of the people she couldn't save in her career, blaming her for their deaths. Oliver, usually so composed, starts to see shadows moving just beyond his vision, always lurking but never fully visible. One night, as they make camp, Lucas disappears without a trace, just as Sophie had. His disappearance leaves Oliver and Clara desperate and terrified. They realize that whatever is in the forest is hunting them, picking them off one by one. With Lucas gone, Clara and Oliver press on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. They return to the abandoned cabin, hoping to find some clue that might explain what is happening. Inside, they discover a hidden compartment under the floorboards, containing old letters and photographs. The letters are from a man who once lived in the cabin, detailing his descent into madness after witnessing the rituals performed by the forest's ancient inhabitants. The photographs show the same ritual site they had found, with figures in dark robes and the same symbols carved into the ground. The final letter warns that the forest is alive, a sentient being that feeds on fear and despair. It lures people in, only to consume them, body and soul. Armed with this knowledge, Oliver and Clara decide to confront whatever is hunting them. They return to the ritual site, hoping to put an end to the curse. As they arrive, the forest comes alive around them, the trees twisting and the ground shaking. The shadows they had seen now take form, figures emerging from the darkness with eyes glowing like embers. In the center of the ritual site, they find Sophie and Lucas, both alive but in a trance, their eyes blank and their bodies motionless. The figures close in, chanting in the ancient language, as the forest itself seems to pulse with malevolent energy. Oliver, using the clues from the journal, attempts to disrupt the ritual by destroying the symbols around the altar. As he does, the figures howl in rage, and the forest erupts in chaos. Clara, drawing on her strength, pulls Sophie and Lucas away from the altar, breaking the trance. With the ritual disrupted, the forest begins to collapse in on itself, the trees twisting and cracking as the ground trembles. The group runs, following a path that seems to open up before them, as if the forest is trying to expel them. Behind them, the shadows scream in fury, their forms disintegrating as the forest loses its power. They emerge from the forest just as the sun rises the village in sight. Exhausted and traumatized, they look back to see the forest now eerily silent, the entrance sealed by the twisted trees. Sophie and Lucas, now free from the trance, have no memory of what happened. But the fear in their eyes tells Clara and Oliver that they know something terrible occurred. Weeks later, back in their respective homes, the group tries to move on, but the events of the forest haunt them. Clara, now more attuned to the supernatural, hears whispers in the wind, the same language from the forest, warning her that the forest's curse is not truly broken. It will find a way to return, and when it does, it will be more vengeful than ever, The story ends with Clara receiving a package in the mail. Inside, she finds the journal they had left behind in the forest. Its page is now blank except for one phrase scrawled across the last page. The forest never forgets. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to my channel and like my video. Thank you for your support.